I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, great.
All right. Welcome, Zhengdao. The people that are here for these lectures, we're here for the 6th lecture. And I have just a brief review, just to remind everyone where we've been. This is lecture 6, and it's going to be about terrifying transferences, aftershocks of infantile trauma. So we're going to be talking about trauma in the first few months of life and the way that that sets up transferences in therapy later. Okay, let's see. Here's my contact information that you've seen before. And here's the website of free psychotherapy books that you need to know about, with many classic books and 23 of my books. Here's the text, the 1983 text, which has been revised now in its 40th anniversary. And it is the text in which I reviewed 100 years of psychoanalytic literature, looking for relational themes and put them in 4 particular categories. Let's see if I can do that. There it is. In 4 different categories. And we'll look at those 4. All right. Recently, after teaching at Kappa, I found that the students there, the candidates there, were very interested in the relational approach, and they wanted a summary book. And so this book is a short book that summarizes the work of really 40 years. So I recommend it. It's fairly easy reading. Now, here are the 4 different levels. We've used these charts each time, and we'll continue using them. The organizing level, the plus or minus 4 months from birth, the symbiotic level, 4 to 24 months, the self-other level or self-object level, the 3 years of age, and the normal neurotic level. Now, common sense tells us that we listen differently and talk differently to children of different ages. And so when we have a child that's in the first 4 months of life, we may talk with a lot of words, but we know the baby has no way of understanding our words. But babies are very fascinated with our facial expressions, with our voice, with our movement, with the way that we hold them, rock them. And so there's a great deal of communication going on here, but it's at the body and affect level. And so we engage them at that level. So when people are bringing relational patterns that were formed in that level, then we need to be able to relate to them in psychotherapy in a similar way. That is, our words will not do it, but rather our emotions and the way that we interact with the person will be the important part. By the time we have a 4 to 24 month old, a toddler running around, the toddler is running around, and the symbiotic experience begins between the mothering persons and the child, in which dances begin. And during this particular period, there's a lot of interaction between caregivers and infant. And babies are learning words, but their life, their emotions are not yet embedded in words or stories. So what goes on is, most importantly, is at the level of the emotional interaction during this period. So when we're looking at relational patterns that have been formed during this particular period in our patients or in ourselves, we're going to be looking not at the verbal expression of them, but at the emotional interaction. So sometimes in our own partnerships or with our children or with our parents, there are patterns which just automatically occur on a relational level, but they're not verbal. By the 3rd year of life, children have begun using words in lots of ways, but the most important thing of 3-year-olds is what Kohut has taught us, the narcissistic see me. Notice how good I am. Notice how strong I am. Notice what a pretty little girl I am. Notice. And so we want to be seen and want to be affirmed during this level. And so to the extent that these patterns continue throughout a lifetime for any of us, we're looking for affirmations of ourself. And Cohen has taught us that the need for narcissistic supplies for self-affirmations is a lifelong endeavor, that till the end of our lives, we're never finished with trying to get our narcissistic needs met. Freud first taught us the activity of a 4 to 7-year-old that he called neurotic, and later we began to realize that neurotic and normal are essentially the same. And by this time, a child has organized his or her experiences into language, into symbols. And so children at this age come running in the house and they tell us a story about what happened. And then we say, well, how did that make you feel? And the child will report their feelings, or their child will report now what they want to do. They want to go back outside and hit Johnny because he threw sand in their eyes. So they know all of these things. And so the patterns here are patterns that start off with narrations, but they're involved in three-way relationships. And it was Freud in 1896, when he was doing his own self-analysis, being a Greek scholar, he noticed that the ancient Greek of Oedipus was a three-way, a mother, father, and a child. And he felt in his own analysis that he was looking at that triangular relationship. And so he called it the Oedipus complex, that which evolves at this particular age. We now realize that it's not simply mother, father, and child, but all emotional relational triangles in a child's life that are active at this time. The child has got to figure out how to relate in triads. That is, if Sammy is my mother and Zilly is my father, then as a child, I have to be able to be aware that I have one relationship with my mother when my father is there, and another relationship with her when my father is not there. So my relationship with my mother is dependent on my awareness, or both of our awareness, of the existence of the father. And the same is true. I have one relationship with my father when it's just the two of us, but when my mother or anyone else enters a triangle, suddenly that relationship is shifted. So the important part here of this level 4 is triangular relationships in which three parties all love and hate each other. That is, ambivalence is what characterizes mature triangular relationships. But today we're going to be looking at the earliest experience of the organizing level, because this is where terrifying transferences that show up in the psychotherapy come from. So now I've also told you that we break these 4 levels down into 7 different fears. And here's the 4 levels in red, the 7 fears. We've looked at them before. They're outlined in the handbook that I recommend to you. Then the next 2 lectures, 7 and 8, are going to be taken from my book called Relational Interventions. And that is treating borderline, bipolar, schizophrenic, psychotic, and characterological personality organizations. So if you want to look ahead, you can go to the free website and download this book and begin to get a feel for what we're going to go through in the next 2 lectures. Or you can also get any of my books on Amazon for $19. Here's the book that we're going to be focusing on today. After I did my studies of psychosis and published them in 1994, the book is called Working the Organizing Experience, and there's another one called In Search of the Lost Mother of Infancy. There are a number of case studies submitted by a number of different therapists, and we felt like we had described very well what the organizing experience looked like when it appears in psychotherapy. But I was sitting with my publisher, Jason Aronson, in New York a little while later, and he leans back and scratches the back of his head and says, well, okay, what's the next book going to be? And I said, no more books, please. I'm tired of writing books. He smiles knowingly and realizes that, of course, writers can't stop. So he said, well, tell me what you're thinking about. And I said, well, in the two books that I have on the organizing experience, I haven't really given the nuts and bolts of it. I haven't really given the this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, to show the development of cases. And so really what I'd like to do is to think about how these transferences develop with different therapists and different patients over time. And he said, well, what do those transferences look like? And I said, they're terrifying, terrifying transferences. And he said, well, there's the title of your next book. And so here it is, Terrifying Transferences, Aftershocks of Childhood Trauma. Let's see, okay. There's a level of stark terror that is known in one degree or another to all of us. Terror haunts our lives and occasionally surfaces in therapy. It's this deep-seated fear, often manifest in dreams or fantasies of dismemberment, mutilation, torture, abuse, insanity, or death. This terror of these things that grips us with terror of being lost forever in time and space, controlled by hostile forces that are stronger than ourselves. Sometimes these overpowering forces are perceived as coming from the outside world. At other times, we may be frightened that the source of these overwhelming terror is inside of ourselves, or worse, we may be caught wavering somewhere between not knowing if the terror that we're experiencing at the moment or in a dream is coming from inside of us or from something out there. We've just been through this pandemic. We're not through it yet, but all of us around the globe have lived with a certain level of terror, terror of getting sick, terror of having to go to the hospital without our loved ones, terror of dying. And these terrors have been living in us for several years, and we're all exhausted. So will we be tortured, attacked, mutilated, or killed? Will we fragment with wild and uncontrollable insanity? And all of us in our own way in the last couple of years through this pandemic have felt these deep stirrings within us, the fragmentations, the exhaustion, the impatience, the anger. It's all part of the terror of being gripped by a disease that is fatal. How can we look directly in the face of such terror as therapists? How can we hold steady with our patients and safely work through is the subject of this book, Terrifying Transferences, Aftershock of Childhood Trauma. I can tell you that many therapists do everything in their power to keep their therapy processes theoretically sound and rationally comprehensible so that we can understand what's going on, so that we know what is happening. So many therapists try to do that. However, more courageous therapists may tiptoe to the brink of this terror and drop into the mire, but they may become so confused, discouraged, disoriented, or frightened, or even ashamed at how they're handling it, that they remain silent about their work the best they can. So shame or embarrassment is a frequent response to regressions that are deeply trying because therapists too often believe that they should somehow know what they're doing, that they should somehow be on top of all situations in therapy. But another group of therapists have been carefully doing this deep work for many, many years, but they don't tell anyone about it, but they know the work is important, and so they remain in the closet about it. Most psychotherapy training in our universities and even in our training institutes fails miserably at teaching therapists about how to recognize and work with deep and treacherous transferences. Considering terrifying transferences takes us directly into the darkest recesses of the psychotherapy situation, where primitive psychotic anxieties silently await for a rendezvous with the therapist and a client. see. Close this one. Stop that sharing. Let me shift my sharing a bit to this. All right. And I'm going to go down my notes.
深深麻烦跟老师说一下，他这个文档不用共享，他在电脑上看就可以了因为这个考虑到时候给学员看这个共享不合适
So Larry, just a quick reminder, with this particular document, the Word document, you don't need to share on the screen. So you can just read it off from your iPad.
All right, but in some things I'd like to have on the screen so that people can read with me. How's that? All right, thank you.
Okay. 然后那个智利老师说，有一些句子他可能还是想要给学生看的，所以说他会呈现一下下。
那没问题，那按老师的，我原来不知道这个情况
Okay, no problem. Yeah.
All right. So what my point here is that psychotherapy is an invitation for the forgotten, hidden, and silent anxieties of childhood, early childhood, and for traumas suffered in infancy to be reawakened, transferred onto the therapist and into the therapeutic relationship. And later in this hour, I'm going to be giving you an example from a colleague of mine where he actually experienced a full-blown psychotic break with his patient during the hour, and I'll share that hour with you. Therapists then willingly make themselves inviting targets, sitting ducks for the transfer or for the projection of primitive anxieties for the aftershocks of childhood trauma. Clients and therapists never know when they start therapy exactly what the work will entail. Okay. When over or understimulating traumas occur in infancy, that is, when there's not enough response from the environment, or when the response from the environment is too strong or overwhelming, in infancy or before birth, such as alcohol fetal syndrome or other pre-birth traumas, when overstimulating or understimulating traumas occur, then a particular scar is left. The situation is quite simple. A baby experiences some need and begins some sort of extension. The unmet need then gathers momentum, intensity, and agitation and distress result. A contraction or constriction process begins in the baby's body. At first, the tightening seems to control or quell the pain, but in time, the self-protective contracting or constricting process becomes painful. So we have a process where a baby is reaching out into the environment, trying to find the world, trying to make sense of what's out there, maybe reaching for a nipple, maybe looking for mother's face, maybe waiting for mother's hand, maybe waiting to be rocked, whatever, but the baby expresses some need. And we're hoping that the mothering persons, whoever they may be, meet this need. And if the need is met, then there's a relationship that goes back and forth that moves us towards the later symbiosis. But if the reaching is reaching and reaching, and there's no one there, then what happens is the tendrils of reaching of that neurological basis wilt. And if the tendrils are reaching, and suddenly there's an injury, they constrict. But in either case, whether there's a wilting at one extreme or a constriction at the other extreme, the message that's left on the neurons, on the neurological circuit that the baby is trying to find the world with, the message that's left there is never reach that way again. And so for a lifetime, people then maintain patterns of constriction and withering so as not to be involved in relationships. So when they come later to the psychotherapy situation, What we're aware of is they may be able to, if they have good intelligence, and if they have learned good cultural habits, they may appear very intelligent and they may be highly praised in the world because they can do certain skills. But when it comes to being able to relate to people in their environment or to the therapist, they cannot relate because too many of their tendrils have been withdrawn, so that they never learned how to live in a symbiosis and never learned, therefore, how to enter the world of human relationships. So with repeated experiences or contraction responses, what comes to be chronically held fear of encountering become life-threatening pain. That is, initially the child's throat may constrict, the jaw may tighten, the face may tighten, the lungs, the hands, the fist, the diaphragm, the intestine, any organ in the body could constrict and tighten in order to stop the pain that the baby is feeling at that moment. But when that happens again and again and again, because the baby is not being responded to, at some point we have a chronic constriction. And so that these people living at this level have many physical complaints, and they have a lot of physical and psychological pain left over from all of these constrictions that were conditioned in infancy. So no one can know at the time of infancy what the future implications of those block in connections will be, or how that neurological blockage may become mentally represented or physically represented later. But we do know it will be marked by pain and agitation and a chronic avoidance of various kinds of interpersonal relating. The child creatively blocks the paths that have brought the frightening, painful, or traumatic experiences. And I want to emphasize that. We have an infant using her creativity to stop the painful stimulation. And she does it by constricting. And so it's a creative response of the baby, but from the standpoint of development, of course, it backfires. And when these primitive blockages are last brought forth years later in therapy, the memories that must be relived in the here and now relationship are body-mind experiences of unbearable physical and physical pain and unspeakable terrors of being re-traumatized. I want to read that paragraph again. When these primitive blockages are at last brought forth in the therapeutic relationship for analysis and transformation, the memories that must be relived in the here and now, we know that transference is the avenue towards development. So the transference memories that must be lived here and now are body-mind experiences of unbearable physical and physical pain and unspeakable terrors of being re-traumatized. There are no words that the patient can use to express these primitive terrors. There's only the body and the body-mind, and involving themselves and perhaps the therapist also in terrifying transferences. We now know from considerable clinical experience that at these moments of intense body-mind remembering, there's often excruciating physical mental pain, and that the fear and resistance to further experiencing traumatic memory becomes directed at the only other human being present, the therapist, or whatever other person might be involved in a trust relationship. Transferences, of course, occur in all relationships, and they're particularly vulnerable to teachers, tutors, choir directors, and children's group leaders. So that anytime there's a trust relationship, the person wants to move towards the connection, but as the relationship begins to develop, the fear of being hurt by the relationship begins to develop. The client feels the pain, know that the therapist or the other person in a trust relationship is responsible for eliciting the pain, and from the primitive place being experienced at that moment, the patient cannot fully distinguish the emerging past body-mind memory from the present experience of pain and terror in relationship to the therapist. The inevitable conclusion of the patient, it's you, the therapist, who are hurting me. And at this point, many of these cases get taken into courts of law. They get taken into, in this country, into our licensing board as formal complaints against the therapist. And over the last 30 years, I've consulted on more than 400 complaints against therapists in 22 states in the United States. And virtually every complaint comes from this particular place. That is, the therapist or average expectable therapist doing average expectable jobs. But as they begin to move the person closer and closer to an empathic relationship, the transference begins to emerge, and the patient begins to fear that the therapist is going to hurt them. And in some way or another, they experience the therapist as hurting them. And at that point, they break off the therapy and go to some complaint process. And it's tragic. And so while in the United States, we have a much more litigious society than you now have in China, as I understand it, still there are complaint processes. And it's quite possible that when the complaints come, they're going to come from this very primitive state that we're going to be looking at today. So there must be many ways of discovering and defining our subjective truths and consciousness, but we therapists are first and foremost storytellers. And so psychotherapy turns out to be a narrational enterprise in which two or more people gather together, patient and therapist, begin to tell stories, begin to relate to each other through words. And the storytelling begins, and each person listens to the story from his or her own vantage points. And so each one of us has our own life history, and so our own early experiences come to bear in the psychotherapy relationship. So each listener is attentive to the emotional load of the stories. The emotional load is expressed in the nonverbal content, the body reactions that accompany the narrations through the sequencing, the pacing, the language employed, the tone of voice, and the various other physical movements to the emotional expressions, energetic vibrations, and muscular constrictions. For many years, we thought it was possible for the therapist to be neutral and to be simply a mirror reflecting back the emotional experiences of the patient. We now know that that's a myth, that patients read us very well. They read us through our body, our voice, our tone of voice, all of the, just who we are as human beings. Our patients relate to that. And so we're not keeping any secrets. The psychotherapy dialogue then begins as both speaker and listener attend to the evolving stories and to the way each is coming to consider the other. And in times, a complex relationship or collaborative endeavor begins to develop. And so the collaboration of the two coming to understand what's developing between us, the stories that are developing between us, is really the definition of consciousness, expanding consciousness. Consciousness is from the Greek words, conscien, meaning knowledge, and us. So it means two people living together and sharing their minds. And that is how the definition of consciousness expansion. So a listener and a speaker might agree to focus or to interact in many different ways, but the consciousness expansion that comes to characterize psychotherapy arises from a dialogue centering on personal relationships, personal modes of meaning and relationships, and using the interpersonal relationship as the jumping off point. And so these 10 lectures and the 10 supervisions that I'll be conducting, and then 2 more questions and answer sessions, will be looking at the way in which the interpersonal relationship is the vehicle through which psychotherapy occurs. Now, as I've said to you in previous lectures, the relational approach to psychotherapy is not another school of psychotherapy. It's rather an approach which all schools of psychotherapy are now beginning to become interested in, because in the last 2 decades, the importance of relationships in psychotherapy have come to the fore, so that all schools of psychotherapy are now interested in the relational kind of thing that we're talking about here. So let's see where I want to go with this. All right. The critical feature from the organizing experience that becomes central to terrifying transferences is the recreation in contemporary relationships, in the therapy relationship, of deep-seated fears conditioned by relationship traumas experienced in infancy, either before or after birth. Transference which evolves in psychotherapy based on infantile trauma during the organizing period is one of being terrified of connecting, of engaging in a full emotional relationship. I'm doing a case conference currently at Kappa, and we're watching the patient, who is very bright, very articulate, who has stories to tell, but who can't emotionally connect to her therapist. And we're beginning to realize she is terrified of actually establishing an emotional engagement with her therapist. All right, let's see. I've got a couple of short little vignettes I'd like to read to you. One man, a patient, who was born with a birth defect that prevented sucking. He had a cleft palate. He was born with that. He sought older women prostitutes and then complained that he couldn't orgasm with them. Soothing, sensual contact was what had been missing in his earliest relationship with his mother. And when he now goes for it in ways that are self-limiting, he focuses on his sexual dysfunction rather than on his self-frustrated yearning for closeness and his terror of the relationship. So he goes to prostitutes that he can't possibly relate with, and then he finds that they are not sexually stimulating to him, and he blames it on them while failing to realize it is his terror of the emotional connection that is involved in sexual intimacy, and that he is terrified of it and therefore has a sexual dysfunction. Another woman client who had been mechanically managed by her mother out of a sense of obligation and duty in infancy begged her therapist for physical touch because she was internally prevented from feeling his mental presence and his mental touch. So she knew from people who had watched her mother, realized that her mother did not know how to relate to her emotionally and physically, and was afraid of touching her. And so she felt deprived of touch. And so she begged for the longest time, please give me some physical touch. Hug me, touch me, hold my hand, let me sit next to you. She begged again and again and again for that kind of physical touch. Let's see, lost my place here. The therapist knew that soothing physical touch that she longed for was available to her in many ways in her life. She had a husband who was very sensual and very warm, and she had several children, and there was a lot of physical contact but her clamor for physical touch from him not only kept him uneasy and distant in the relationship, but prevented the very mental and emotional closeness and soothing that would allow her to participate in transformational relating. That is, so long as she was saying and making demands, touch me, all of this, he was held back, kind of frozen, knowing that he did not want to engage in physical touch with her. She had plenty of sources of it elsewhere, but trying to help her understand what her need was. But her demand and demand and demand kept him at bay, and until finally she began to realize that she was creating with him the distance that she, in fact, had experienced in infancy. Another man, a patient, maintains a schizoid or bored demeanor in relationships until the other person almost forcibly approaches him with overriding, warm, affirming interest. He thinks he's afraid to approach others because he might be rejected, but in fact, his manner staves off the possibility of connections that he is terrified of. When there are brief moments of connection with his therapist, he suffers terrifying nightmares and phobias the following night. He remains stuck in the belief that others don't relate to me the way I need it. They don't approach me right. Numerous therapy relationships end with the client bitterly complaining about the shortcomings of the therapist. Yet when the interaction is closely scrutinized, we can see that the clamor and the accusatory cries only serves to justify the client's retreat, and that there's an unwillingness or an inability to continue negotiating the relating, thereby derailing the therapeutic process. The content of the clamor is designed to fend off meaningful relating. And we'll talk a lot about that in the next two sessions when I talk about the word clamor. You'll have to look that up in Chinese to discover what it means, but the way we use it in English, it's pejorative. That is, if someone is clamoring, they're making a lot of loud noise and they're alienating people. Now, the way we use it in psychotherapy is we understand in infancy, the child begins to make noise and reaching and arching her back. The child begins to do something to express, I need something. And when that need isn't first coming, the cry becomes louder, louder and louder and louder, until finally the child is clamoring. And so by the time the person comes to psychotherapy, the clamor, that is all the talk of the hour that is not engaged in interpersonal relating, the clamor serves as a defense against the relating. All right. Good. Oh, we're doing good. All right. This next case is a lengthy one. We're going to join it in the 8th year, as a matter of fact. The case was submitted by a therapist named Sean Stewart. Sean was a quadriplegic. That is, all 4 of his limbs were paralyzed. He had some movement in his fingers, and yet he managed to go and go to school and become a therapist. But he moved in a wheelchair, electronic wheelchair. So he could use his wheelchair and he could use his phone. But when he started this case, we didn't have, when we started, we didn't have cell phones, but by the time we come to the 8th year, we did have cell phones. He was part of a swimming team that was on an international tournament in Australia, and the whole team was diving off of rocks into the ocean, and he dived and hit his head and was instantly paralyzed. So he spent many years becoming a professional therapist, and I met him when he was in his internship studying, and this man that we're going to talk about, his patient, came to him and So he was seeing him in a training clinic, but his supervisor felt that this patient was very dangerous and wanted him to terminate the patient. And all of the people who worked in the clinic, the secretaries and so forth, everyone was afraid of this man. This was done in the city of Long Beach, California, and there's a heavy racial prejudice there against blacks. He was black, but he's psychotic. And so he's disheveled and he does strange things. And he looks weird coming in and out of the clinic. And so, but Sean took a liking to this man and felt he wanted to work with him. So he asked his supervisor, could I go to someone else who will supervise me with this, an outside supervisor? And she said yes. And so he sought me out. And so we did a year of individual supervision. And then he's been in a group now for another 7 or 8 years. So that meets weekly. And our group discusses different cases. So the group and I know this patient very well after 8 years. So this is going to be, I'm going to discuss the case a bit. And then when I was doing this book, Terrifying Transferences, I put out a letter. We didn't have emails in those days. This is in 88, 89. I put out a letter to all the therapists that I knew that had psychotic patients they were working with, organizing patients. And I said, I want to write this book, and I want to present case studies by different therapists showing how they worked with this organizing experience. And I got some wonderful cases. So this book has got 12 long-term cases in it of treatment of organizing experiences by 12 different therapists. Every therapist is different, every patient is different. And so it's a very rich book in terms of case material, showing how different therapists have struggled with this, working with psychotic experiences. So I'm going to stick fairly close to my text here. I've abbreviated the text of this hour in the service of time. So I start off this case with comments of my own. And my comments are: a regular aspect of countertransference in response to organizing transference is the arousal or revival in the therapist of a fragmenting fear that we are not being heard, responded to, or being acknowledged as real and present person in the therapy relationship. That is, a countertransference response that is unavoidable when we're working with an organizing experience is this person is talking, telling stories, doing things, but not relating to us, not engaging with us. And what that does is that stimulates our most primitive organizing experiences when we were once babies, and in the various times when our mothers or mothering persons didn't come to us in the time frame we wanted, or didn't do for us the thing that we wanted. Babies are not very communicated about exactly what their needs are. So parents have to keep guessing. But all of us had imperfect organizing experiences. And so we all have some scars that are deep that we might call organizing or psychotic. So when we try to relate to someone and they can't relate back, they can't respond back, it stimulates our own very primitive organizing countertransference. And we'll see this in this particular case with Sean. Our own deepest fears date back to infancy, when we reached out hoping or needing to connect to our own mothers, and either no one was there or we were somehow painfully rebuffed. When the organizing transference is operating, we therapists find ourselves reaching out, struggling to be responded to, and then collapsing or fragmenting in our own sense of despair or terror. So here I'm going to be reading from the actual. So what I did when people who are going to present cases for this book, I set the tape recorder going, and we got permission from the patient. And so I'm going to read from the actual tape recording transcript of this hour, although it's abbreviated. Sean speaking. Eddie and I, Eddie is the client, are now in our 8th year now together, and I want to report an amazing encounter we recently had. Eddie and I set up a week when we were going to meet 3 times instead of our regular 2. So we were going to meet on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and also are going to have 5-minute phone contact every night. The regular contact calls we've been having for some time now give us a sense of connection, even if they're just a couple of minutes. Now, somewhere in the next few sessions, where we're talking about these organizing experiences, I'll be explaining the value of what we call contact calls, because an infant can't hold mother in mind more than 24 hours, if that. And so if mother is gone a week or 3 or 4 days, mother's just simply gone. And so one of the things we find with these people who live in the organizing experience, their mind is in a regressed primitive state, and they simply can't hold on to the therapist for twice a week or for 3 times a week. And so during periods of regression, it's not during the whole therapy, but during periods of regression, we set up what we call contact calls, and they're at the convenience of the therapist. The therapist knows on Tuesday at 4:30, actually I can make a 5-minute call. On Thursday at 7:30, I can make a call. So the therapist sets up at his or her convenience times when he or she could call the client. And it's important that you call the client because the client needs to be called. And then we're not doing therapy in these calls. We're going to just make contact and talk about whatever comes to mind. The woman that taught me this was raised in Vienna reading Freud as she grew up. And when she began to work with psychotic patients, she supervised me with them. And she was a cat lady. So she had 3 or 4 cats, and they would be in her consulting room. And so they'd be on the phone, and they would talk about their cats or the headlines on the newspaper, talk about Ukraine, whatever, or talk about the weather or anything else, just for 5 minutes, so that there's this awareness that I know about you. I have you in my mind. You have me in your mind, and we're going to meet on Tuesday. And those contact calls become a very important part of technique with people who are living organizing experiences during their organizing regression, not necessarily during the whole period. But during this period, Eddie and Sean have been having contact calls virtually every day. So here's Sean speaking. In his own way by now, after 8 years, Eddie can describe the theory of the organizing transference. He puts it in terms of his reaching out for contact with mother and encountering some kind of violent intrusion that breaks the contact, and then the pulling back of the reaching tendril with the resolution to never go there again. So he's saying, Eddie, can he say that after 8 years? Basically, he says, Eddie now understands the sense of violent intrusions he often feels when he's with me as being replicated much earlier in his life. He now understands his experienced intrusions with me as sometimes very real because I made a mistake, and at other times as transferred representations of his life's earliest intrusions. Usually the associations start with something present and then go back in time. Eddie's come to believe that the violent intrusions started for him before he was born, when his mother's not wanting to be pregnant affected him. She was schizophrenic, way out schizophrenic. He believes that her body was biologically pulling away from his, even while he was a fetus. Larry, why did you decide now to increase the contact time at this point in time? Sean, because Eddie and I had not been able to get together enough the previous month in our usual twice-a-week way. I thought it was because he was having troubles at the homeless shelter that he now manages. So part of the 8 years, he was in a halfway house, and then he finally became pulled together enough to be in a homeless shelter. And then at some point, as he began to develop his mind, he was asked to be the manager of the homeless shelter. And so he is a manager, and he has a separate apartment there at the homeless center. And he's treated very well because he does a very good job at it. And so that he has a separate apartment from the homeless psychotic people that are living there now, instead of being housed with him, which is his way of differentiating himself concretely. Last month, his car was breaking down. There was rain that flooded the streets. He's been having problems with his teeth, so he was going through a period of a lot of pain. We just weren't able to meet as often as usual, so we had to spend more time on the phone, but phone time is different than being with him. After missing him for so long, I found myself saying, we haven't seen each other much lately, Eddie. Your car's working now. Who knows what's going to happen next week? We really need more time together. Let's get it on. Come on. I gently pushed, and he was up for it. So we decided to meet 3 times weekly for a while. We've done that occasionally before, even when things were going fairly well. So Sean is now reading from he took notes in the session, so he's reading from them. The first Monday on our new time schedule, Eddie comes in feeling very good with his dentures in. He's got full dentures. So Mary in the group says, having his dentures in, that's a sign he's feeling good? Sean, yes, that's a sign, because his dentures often hurt him and he can't or doesn't wear them. He's looking really great, and he's very color coordinated. He's very well dressed, which is a sign there's a connection to social consensus for him by how well things are put together. And he's laughing and he's feeling good. He was feeling pretty dapper, and he knew it. This is quite a feat for someone who's been so socially inept for so many years. So when we started, 8 years ago, anyone would have seen him as a burnt out schizophrenic, a total emotional and social wreck. Larry, did he elicit a comment from you? Sean, yes, he did. He came in smiling with his glasses on. He knows he looks good. I say, Eddie, you look wonderful today. This is the best I've ever seen you look. I was sincere, and I really was thinking I wouldn't mind having a shirt like that. He was able to take my compliment in and laugh and tell me, thank you, and to feel good about it. So the point here is that in this Monday session, he's being socially appropriate, he's dressing well, and he's having some fun with Sean. The spontaneity, he says, and repartee were fun for both of us. By the way, there were no voices at all this day. Eddie often still hears murmuring of some sort or another, but no murmuring today. Now, in the past, when he first started, there were all kinds of voices and telling him to kill himself and one thing and another. But finally, the voices went down to a murmur, and they're often there. But today, when he's feeling dapper and looking good, there's no murmuring. And we were able to expand playfully. And so I can, even at one point, I said, you can't do that. And Eddie is able to respond, I can very well do just what I want. And so it seems like this exchange of a little bit of laughter is consolidating for him. Part of his growing sense of consolidation, he's realizing that he's able to take me on a bit, to stay with the conflict, and no demons comes in and says, you're a piece of shit, which used to happen to him quite frequently. He's getting built up from this moment. So this is the essence of Monday. So from the very beginning, the room would fill with demons. Then at times it would fill up with little green men. And so in the first few years of therapy, he was wildly schizophrenic, delusional as hell. And that's basically gone. So that's Monday, basically, says Sean. We talked briefly on the phone that night, and then we talked briefly again on Tuesday night. Wednesday's session was somewhat similar. He's fairly well dressed and he's doing fairly good, but I was noticing it's not quite as good. Whereas Monday was a 10, Wednesday is a 7. we're doing the same thing, but I'm also noticing in me as well, in the countertransference, I'm not feeling as good about him. I'm not feeling as good about us. So we talked again on Wednesday night, and we had made a solid interpersonal contact Monday, and predictably by Thursday, he's starting to break down. Now, this is the piece that we're going to be looking at in the next 2 sessions, particularly, that what we expect when we're working with the organizing transference is once the person does begin to relate and engage emotionally, to where the therapist and the client are feeling connected, and they're feeling like we had some good moments this session, even if it's only part of the session, or we had a good session, then what we expect immediately after that is some kind of regression or breakdown. The reason is because the good positive contact brings up the terror that I will be hurt. And this is the transference from the infant trauma. I reached out to my mother hoping for something wonderful, but instead I was hurt in some way or abandoned in some way. So the transference at the organizing experience is always the transference of expecting to be hurt by the person that one is reaching out and connecting with. So Sean is saying here, we had this wonderful connection on Monday, so we're expecting him to break down. And by Thursday night on the phone, he's not doing so well. He's not feeling good. He has headaches, he tells me. The voices are beginning to speak to him. The murmuring started late Wednesday night. Murmuring means auditory hallucinations that he can't quite understand. Earlier, they were saying, "You're a piece of shit. You should go kill yourself," and things like that. But by now, there's no contact. But by Thursday, he's hearing the voices again, and he's feeling strange things. There's a couple of problems at the shelter with the clients where he works. Things aren't going right in his life. There are many little details that are going sour on him. So Sean is aware that Eddie is deteriorating in the wake of the great Monday session and the very strong interpersonal connection, and the Wednesday session that was also fairly good. So those were containing and solid interactions with real personal contact occurring between us. So Larry makes a comment here, watch out now. Connection has been made and connection has been felt by both people. So watch out, let's see what happens. Sean, Eddie wakes up Friday morning. This is going to be our 3rd section this week. He's noticing early in the morning that there's a police officer patrolling the area where he lives. He had a bad encounter in the early 70s where he had a problem with a cop. A cop beat him up. He's a schizophrenic Black person, but the cop abused him. The abuse was so bad that he actually got a settlement in a lawsuit from the city of Long Beach. So Eddie is paranoid of police. Eddie's Black, so there's not only violence, but racial overtones. By Friday morning, he's really in a psychotic place. So in his mind, the police officer is not merely patrolling the neighborhood, which so far as I could tell he's doing, but the cop is experienced as actually watching Eddie, spying on him, and out to get him. The cop is waiting for an opportunity to attack him, just as he was attacked in the early 70s and beaten up badly. By Friday morning, his body is in all kinds of hypochondriacal pain. He's hearing the voices saying, "You're a piece of shit. The man's going to get you." Man is slang, Black slang for cops, police. "You're a piece of shit. The man's going to get you." He's having all kinds of physical problems. He can't put his dentures in because his mouth hurts so much. So he comes in with bare gums, which it affects his speech. And I think that's important because there's a 4-month-old infant quality when he doesn't have his teeth in. And his teeth, his aggressive potential, are also taken out of his mouth. So he gets to my office safely. He was all right driving, but he felt the policeman was following him. He felt that the policeman was talking to other cops and that they were monitoring him with their radios. He looked in his rear view mirror, feeling very scared. However, the terror is intensifying the closer he gets to my office. So you can see where the real terror is, another emotional connection with Sean. It's a strange thing as he expresses it. On one level, he feels like he's fleeing the cop. And another level, he feels like he's coming to something even worse terror when he gets near my office and nearer to our time together. He walks in, and I'm not doing my best that day either. So in the countertransference, I'm explicitly responsive to the transference psychosis. He's not dressed very well, as he has been lately. His hygiene isn't as good. He hasn't showered. He doesn't have his teeth in, and he's got his sunglasses on. Now, during the second and third years of treatment, Eddie always wore his sunglasses. And there's another case in the book about playing peekaboo with sunglasses, because Sean understood that sunglasses were a way of not having contact. And so as they began to interpret them over time, it got to be sometimes Eddie would take his sunglasses off, or he'd put them on or take them off. And so that began to be the symbol of, can I connect with you or not? But on this day, he came in with his sunglasses on again. So he's in defense. On Wednesday, he came in and took his sunglasses off. He set them on the table, and we laughed together as we reflected back to the days his sunglasses used to shield him from contact with me. This is always in our minds now, the sunglasses. When we think about the old days and is always hiding behind his sunglasses, we laugh because that was a wonderful working through time for both of us. So some Friday when he comes in, he doesn't take his sunglasses off. He's feeling paranoid and angry. A bystander might say, oh, you've got a paranoid schizophrenic in your office right now. He's very unstable and he's probably very dangerous. So he's aware that Eddie was a mess. He was so visibly agitated that I began immediately feeling scared. This is only the second time in 8 years I've ever felt scared with Eddie. As I talked to him, he was breathing heavily and irregularly. Jeannie in the group says, his breathing is important here. Yes, when your diaphragm is paralyzed, it's even more important. I didn't really have to ask him much. I said, Eddie, tell me what's happened. Right away, he knows why he's there. He knows he's here to tell me what happened. So he sits down and he begins to just go off into a tirade about this police officer. This motherfucking cop is patrolling him, out to get him. And God damn it, if he comes near me, God damn it, if he's going to have to draw his gun, because God damn it, I'm going to get him. He's saying this with intensity, sunglasses on, and he's furious. He starts off talking about the cop and the situation, but he's talking wildly at me. He's raging at me, telling me all this. And it's so intense, and his controls seem so tenuous that I'm feeling quite scared. Remember, Sean is in a wheelchair. But Eddie and I have worked long and hard to get to this moment. So I allow myself to feel scared. What Sean is saying, if we're going to replicate the experience with his psychotic mother and how frightened he was when his mother yelled at him, then I have to allow myself to feel the fear that he must have felt as an infant. It's a way of my seeing and knowing where he's at. But while I'm feeling frightened by this madman in front of me, I'm also feeling strangely very safe. I think we spent a lot of years structuring a safe frame for this to occur in. There are people in the office just outside. There are secretaries and others I can call on a moment's notice. I've got my phone on hand with the 911 button I can hit. So now I'm safe, just like he knows he's safe here. So what Sean is really saying is we have worked 8 years to get to the point where his psychotic experience with his mother could be relived in the here and now with us. And it has to do with terror. It has to do with fear. And so we both know we've worked to get here, but we both know we have to feel the fear. And what I'm doing, Sean says, is I'm allowing him to go into it. I say, I want you to be able to feel my presence now, Eddie. and I just let him go. He heard me. He's gummy like an infant because of his teeth. The voices in his head are now very loud for him, calling a piece of shit. He's convinced at this moment that these are the demons and that they're outside of him. His schizophrenic mother also had demons, and so his whole childhood was filled with demons, and then later little green men. So at this moment, these demons, let's see, he's convinced at this moment that these are demons and that they're outside of him, screaming at him. He's talking about this cop. His face is grimacing, almost as if to say, let yourself experience me. It almost looks like his face moves closer to me. All of a sudden, the full-blown rage is directed right at me. Like I'm the motherfucking cop. He's calling the cop a motherfucker, but he's shouting and glaring at me. It's as though he's shouting at another invisible person by talking to me. I feel the emotional force behind it directed fully at me. I'm feeling as scared as I've ever felt. This is intense. I'm letting myself feel fear. Deep terror is a strange thing. It vibrates through your entire body, but another part of me is saying, I don't care what anybody says, I know I'm safe. I know this man is not going to get up and hit me or do any damage to my furniture, and he knows it too, but we have to live this out. He's allowing himself to be in a very scary place. I've invited him to be. A feeling that he reported that later on when we processed this session, that he was allowing himself to feel in a very scary place. So during his tirade, it slipped out that he had forgotten to take his antipsychotic medication today. This turns out to be important because forgetting for Eddie now functions very differently than it did for him 8 years ago. Now there's a purpose to his forgetting. He doesn't simply forget things or lose track of things anymore. So I realize he's unconsciously saying, we've made a frame where we can experience my psychosis together. I can hang on to Sean while I'm feeling quite crazy. The medication is going to get in the way of my having the psychotic experience I need to have, so I'm not going to take my medication today. I think unconsciously, that's how we thought about it. Maybe even consciously. I also thought, we need to just experience this now. Later on, I'll give interpretations. Cindy in the group says, Sean, I am really impressed. This is very helpful to me to see how present you are with yourself and how present you are with him as this fear surfaces in both of you. I know you've worked very hard to get to this place. We've watched this develop for years, and now you're in a place that you've both been working toward. I'm very impressed. Sean, thank you. That's a very welcome comment because I know you followed this work with Eddie for a long time. I've struggled for years trying to stay present during our sessions, not to be bored or irritated, not to daydream. I've struggled to get him to be present, not to wander off in his delusions or the little green man. It's a function of our work together to be able to stay present with each other emotionally. We don't daydream anymore. And I'm certainly not daydreaming in this session, and our group laughs. Of course you're not daydreaming. Sean says, I feel good that I've developed the ability to stay present and to focus this psychotic transference onto me in what I believe is a contained way. When I heard that he had forgotten to take his medication, which he never does, I knew for sure we were where we needed to be. But I will admit, even though I felt safe, I'm using my countertransference to assess his fear. It seems you can't deal with this level of transference terror without really feeling on the edge of danger. Terror is an experience you can only know. You can't intellectualize about it. Larry, I'm hearing you say there's two things going on in the room simultaneously. On the one hand, you know, and it also seems like Eddie knows, that there's a frame or a setup that you've both spent a long time working on so that a certain quality of interpersonal experience can occur. You both feel the setup is essentially safe. but the experience that needs to occur within that frame is of a frightening, terrifying, dangerous nature. So both of you are allowing it. He didn't take his medication, and you're feeling closer and more scared. He's allowing himself to move towards being more out of control. You're feeling the fear that he's lived with since infancy with his raging psychotic mother, but neither of you goes into a panic. You both know this situation must be lived out. You've both certainly rehearsed it many times together in miniature forms, lots of different short forms before now, but now you're actually trying to live it out together so vividly. Sean says, yes, you're absolutely right. And as he gets out of control, his out of control is being carefully focused on me. So there's a control in his out of control, and both are directed at me. That's an interesting paradox here. He's in charge of his out of control experience. He wants and intends me to be with him, to know, to share his lifelong terrifying experiences. He needs to know that I see him, and that I know him, and that from inside, I know his terror. Larry, right. It takes a long time to reach such a mutual understanding, a consensus, such a delicate balance in the working alliance. Sean, it's not merely directed out to the universe. Most psychotic episodes are diffuse, chaotic, fragmented, basically undirected or uncontrolled. The person is just in the psychotic state, hallucinating or whatever. This is an intense and interactional communication, and both of us are feeling our parts in this intense interpersonal connection. Larry, exactly. This is so very important to understand in order to be able to assess you and your and his safety. We're living, Sean says, in a controlled, out of control. Larry, there's no question he's in the room with you, that he intends for you to share his experience, to feel his demons talking to you. He knows he's scaring you, and that you must feel this to understand him, and for him to come to understand this part of himself. Sean, that's what I've gotten so much of from being in this group, an understanding of how we can follow these primitive states. Gary, so Eddie's now able to bring all the paranoia into the session. Larry, you finally got the psychotic transference active in the here and now, and you judge that its expression is safe at the level of an intended communication. The reality testing is functioning. But at the level of the interpersonal contact, he's lost the reality testing function. Sean, their paranoia isn't about little green men he used to literally see on the wall. Now the little green man is coming out of my mouth and out of my eyes. It starts off in a diffuse way with us talking about cops, but as we hone in on it, as we focus in on it, and I'm allowing it, feeling the fear, assessing the safety, Larry, it's you're a motherfucker and you're out to get me. Sean, right. There's something to say about feeling on edge here, because if he ever did haul off and hit me, I'm sure he would be surprised. I know I would be. Larry, there's always a sense of exploring psychotic anxiety that you're on the edge. This is why Kohut, in his 1984 posthumous book, when he talks about psychotic transference, he basically says that he didn't know why anyone would ever want to revive this primitive, chaotic pre-self as an experience and analysis. He believed that in principle, this work could be done, but he knew that he personally could not do it. The tools were not available to him, but he knew the strain it would have to be on both the patient and the therapist, and he wondered why anyone would be willing to put themselves through it. Why anyone was willing to do it? Eddie is, of course, the reason. We're almost finished here. Sean says, my sense is that during this session, my ego split in two, and this experience must be remembered and recalled. And so we spent 8 years working up this case, and at a key moment, the psychotic transference is in place, and it's a very terrifying one. So I urge you to get this book and to read these 12 cases. This is one of them, and this case is much longer with many more details in it for you. So, Sammy, help me here. We've got a little bit of time left.
那我们现在还有一点时间，剩下来是给老师们的 Q&A。
那个我在聊天框发了这一段哈，这个是上一次谈到的，想问一下拉瑞老师，就是说在这个内容上，就是尝试最低水平，尝试在最低水平上进行解释，和这个在形式上，新尝试在最高的抽象水平上解释，老师能不能详细说一下，或者举一些临床材料解释一下？这个没有完全理解。
So, Larry, Julie actually posed a question on our chat box.
All right.
And this is not from this week. It's from the last time that we did the recording. And he's not quite cool. He's just wondering whether or not you could elaborate a little bit more for these two different levels involved. Give a bit more example to kind of like let us know what it really means by content-wise and also the form-wise.
Oh, we're going back to content-wise and form-wise. Okay.
Yes. You know, because we have the lowest level and also, and also abstraction, yes.
Okay, this is slightly different than what we're talking about now, but it's relevant. When I talk about in speaking the countertransference or interpreting it, or any kind of interpretation, we can talk about the content of the interpretation, and we can talk about the form of the interpretation. The content is whatever's being talked about, but when we get down to the borderline and organizing levels, the words, the content can't really be talked about. So even though the patient may be using a lot of content, telling a lot of stories, what we're interested in is the actual interaction, which we'll see in the next two sessions is going to be very different for level 1 and level 2. But in both of those levels, verbal interpretations will not help because the transference experience is not in words. And so it's got to be done in actions. And so in the next two sessions, we'll talk specifically about that. So the form of the interaction at the organizing level is the emotional interaction that we just had with Sean and Eddie. They got down to it and they were talking about motherfucking cops and one thing and another. But what was important was the body reaction, the fear, the terror, the trauma that they were experiencing with each other, which was a replication. So the words were not so important as the emotional experience. So the form of the interpretation is the emotional interaction, okay, and that they sustained it, that Sean held it and Eddie held it while they went through the terror. Now at level 2, the form is a little different because remember, we've got a symbiosis, and so we've got a scenario. I do this, you do this, you do this, I do this. And so what we're looking for there is the way in which the scenario is being acted out in the transference and the countertransference. And again, since the scenario is pre-verbal, the patient cannot speak it. And so we have to allow ourselves to live it with the patient. And in living it with the patient, at some point, one or the other of us may find ways to begin speaking it. So these two lower levels are pre-verbal, and so the content is useless. The form is everything. That is, the interactive form is everything. And in the next two lectures, I'm going to take up the organizing experience in detail and the borderline experience, symbiosis experience in detail. That's what we'll be coming to next. And this will be clarified even more. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. I know this case is hard to respond to. It's so intense.
Yeah, Laura, I have a question about this case.
Go ahead, Lily.
Actually, Actually, I'm very, very deeply touched by this case. Even when I read this case yesterday evening, and when I heard it again, it's still very touching. And I thought about that, and then I had a question in my mind. I think the therapist and the client finally went to this very critical point after 80 years work.
Yes.
So my question is, why? So what's the important thing in the 80 years work? Because I recall some of my psychotic patients, it's hard to build such a safe base. Sometimes they left me after 1 year or 2 years. So the question is, what's the important thing in the 8 years job?
Good question. All right. And again, in the next lectures, I'll be talking about that. Part of this, the reason it took 8 years was that Sean and I were sort of learning about this as we went. You see, because this had not been really talked about before so much. So it took us maybe a little longer. I think now that we understand the nature of the organizing and the symbiotic experiences, as therapists, we may be able to move a little more quickly. But human development takes time. And so we can't expect it to happen overnight. So the way I generally talk about it is the first phase is a phase of developing trust. And so what we talk about, what we do doesn't matter. We're just trying to make it where the patient who's afraid of relationships at least feels safe in the room, that you're not going to do anything sudden to hurt them. And then as the trust begins to develop, during that year or two that trust takes to develop, you, the therapist, will be looking for you'll be looking for the patterns, whether they're the organizing pattern of relating or the symbiotic pattern of relating. You will be looking for them, and you'll be trying to call the patient's attention to them. The patient won't be able to get it for a while, but you will begin to have a sense of how this particular person approaches and what frightens them and how they run away. And so you'll be able to work with it better. And the same is with the borderline. By the time you do the trust, you begin to understand what the scenarios in this person's life are. So your question really underlines why it's so important that we think developmentally relationships, and why we understand that there are many people that come in with organizing experiences or symbiotic experiences. And when we're in with them, we can't expect verbal interpretations to help. Interactions, emotional interactions are where it's going to be important. Now, I'm talking about this as though these 4 levels were levels of development. And really, you notice I continue to call them listening perspectives. And the reason for that is because they're abstractions that we can have in our mind. So as we can begin to hear what are the kinds of relational interactions this patient is bringing to us. And so as we begin to realize the patterns of their interactions, we can then have a sense of how we can join them, how we can be present with them. And again, in the next 2 lectures, I'm going to be talking about that in some detail in that. So it takes years. There's no question of that. And that's not our fault. That's because patients were badly damaged. Now, all of us, as I've said before, we all once were in mother's arms searching for the breast, and we all had organizing traumas. And we all had borderline symbiotic traumas, and we all had self-object traumas and triangular traumas. So in our own analysis, even though we may have developed up to where we use words and symbols, at the time that we're actually involved in a relationship with our analyst, we may be living an organizing experience, reliving that. So it becomes very important for all of us as therapists to understand these 4 different levels. There could be 40 levels, but these 4 have developed over 100 years of study. And it's important for us to understand them so we can understand the patients, but also so we can understand our countertransference when it comes up. Okay. Do we have time for one more quick question? Not that my answers were ever quick.
I just wanted to say how I moved by the session, by this
Yes.
class. And especially when I heard you say that allow you to fear, to have the feeling of fear. And I also think of in my clinical work, like sometimes it's not so easy for me to allow myself to be angry, to be wrong, to be
Right. Yes.
or something that's really very that sentence is important. Another thing is you said that the important thing is how we join with the patient's internal.
Yes. Yes.
That's the key.
And you're right. If the patient, let's think of a symbiotic patient, if the patient, let's say, is bringing a symbiotic scenario involving rage at one another, and we feel like we can't express our anger, we're never going to be in contact with that patient. We've got to let them provoke us and then find some way. And the way when I need to express that anger or something like that, I end up saying, okay, listen to me out of 2 sides of my mouth. Out of one side of my mouth, I'm very, very angry with you because of this, this, and this. But out of the other side of my mouth, I'm saying, I think we're doing just what we need to do. I think the fact that you're provoking me to anger is showing you and me both how important it is. Now let's talk about it. Okay. All right. Okay, we've got to stop, huh? I'll see you soon. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Larry,
Yes.
对，问老师
Larry, can
有一
you?
会儿啊，我跟他聊点事
Yeah.
儿。
Okay.
Sorry, Larry, would you
Good.
please stay for another 10 minutes?
Yes.